Last week we were talking about Bible reading and how critical it is for our spiritual well-being. And one of the things that was suggested to me years and years ago by a preacher was read through the Psalms. The book of Proverbs once a month. And that's just one chapter a day if the month has 31 days. And then if you wanted to read Psalms, that would be 5 chapters a day. And most of the time, that's pretty easy reading. But every month in the book of Proverbs, you'd find some new nugget, if you will, because you are in a different spot in your journey. Tonight, I want to talk about the beauty of wisdom. Because if we do not value wisdom, if we don't exalt wisdom, if we're not seeking wisdom, it won't be fine. And yet she's crying out, and she's crying out loudly. She wants to be heard, and she's personified over and over again in this wonderful book of Proverbs. And you think about our legacy. Our legacy won't be how much money we've made, how many people know our names, what we've accomplished with our lives. It will be our spiritual heritage. Because our children, our relatives that we've influenced to obey the gospel, to serve the Lord, that's going to last eternally. And that's the greatest heritage that we can have. But it's hard. It's difficult. And we just have a few short years to instill these wonderful traits. And then, of course, kind of nurture that when they leave home by being a good example and trying to follow the Lord. I want to begin in verse 1, and I'll be quoting mostly tonight in the English Standard Version. Very readable, very accurate translation. He says in verse 1, "Hear, O sons, a father's instruction, and be attentive that you may gain insight." What is he saying? The things that I'm going to tell you, they're really important. And there are a lot of things that it's not so important that you learn. You think about the years I spent in college and the courses that I took, and how much of that have I ever used? Most of it, I haven't. And I wonder, what is a music major studying the physics of music? And of course, the physics teacher, he pitied us because he knew that we had no interest in physics, and so he made it fun. And but anyway, that's another story. But the physics of music, you know how often I have used that in life? Never, not one time. Matter of fact, I can't remember one thing that I learned in that class. But that's the way of life. But what he is saying is the things that I'm telling you, they're essential, they're critical. And if you miss these things, you miss life. Because this is what it's all about. He says in verse 2, "For I give you good precepts. Do not forsake my teachings." Good doctrine is good precepts. I think about the people that have pulled down statutes and burned cities and put up barricades so the police could not get in, so they were free to sell their drugs. They were even free to commit murder. There were murders that occurred in these blocked off sections, and the police couldn't even get to them. And I think there are people that have not been taught. Or maybe they've been taught the wrong things. And what I'm saying, if we were in that situation and we had heard all of these things, and it's frightening. Because I've heard things in the classrooms that I knew was foolishness, not because I was smart, because I wasn't. I was certainly not worldly smart, but it disagreed with the Bible. And if it disagreed with the Bible, then I knew that it could not possibly be true. And so these people have been taught lies all of their life, and it has filled them with anger and rage, and they want to destroy something. Well, we can pull down every statute in America, and you know how much history that has changed? Nothing. It happened. And there's no way we can undo it. Did bad things happen? Absolutely. And that's true of the North. That's true of the South. That's true in the Revolutionary War. That's true in the French Indian War. All those things, bad things happen. But they did happen. And whether we acknowledge it or not, we can't go back and rewrite history. But what we're doing is we understand how important. And now more than ever, we need to teach these principles. Because it wasn't that long ago that the schools reinforced what you were taught at home and what you were taught in church. You had scripture reading, and you had prayers, and most of the people, they went to church. But those times, they're gone. And so it's so critical. And we don't know, parents, how important it is when you have all of these things that are trying to undermine the teachings of the scriptures, how critical it is to instill these values in our children. They're good precepts, as opposed to false precepts, as opposed to wrong precepts. Listen to this passage. It's a lengthy passage, and we know the time of Jeremiah. Jeremiah lived during the time of Daniel. Daniel's in Babylon prophesying. Ezekiel's in Babylon prophesying to the common man. And Jeremiah is left alone in Jerusalem, Judea, and he's prophesying to these people. And he's telling them that the reason we're in such a predicament is that we have dishonored God. We have not listened to him. We have not obeyed God. So he writes, "Behold," this is God speaking, "I will gather them from all the countries to which I drove them in my anger and my wrath and in great indignation." What he is talking about are the people that were dispersed by the Babylonians, and they've been scattered, and the people that were not taken to Babylon, they ran to other countries to get away from Babylon. He said, "I will bring them back to this place, and I will make them dwell in safety. And they shall be my people, and I will be their God. I will give them one heart and one way, that they may fear me forever, for their own good and the good of their children after them." So what's he saying? I want you to have a full life. I want your children to have a full life. And the only way that we can have this is to do it God's way. When all the world is screaming at the top of their lungs, that's foolishness. We know that it is the truth. "I will make with them an everlasting covenant." Now, what is he talking about here? He's talking about far more than the return to Jerusalem and rebuilding the temple. He's talking about you. He's talking about me. The covenant that God made when he sent his son, Jesus, to die in our stead and to purchase us, redeem us with his blood. "That I will not turn away from doing good to them, and I will put the fear of me in their hearts, that they may not turn from me. I will rejoice in doing them good, and I will plant them in this land in faithfulness with all of my heart, in all of my..." He says, I am committed to your well-being. I am committed to your spiritual health. And I'm going to do everything possible to make sure you get home. That doesn't mean that bad things are not going to happen. Because sometimes we have to be reminded that we're only here temporary. And I think that's why it's so important to study the book of Daniel and the book of Revelation, because there's 4 beasts in the book of in the book of Daniel. And the 4th beast is the most terrible beast, and that's the one that's talked about in the book of Revelation. And I think what he's talking about is when man does his very worst, God's people can still overcome. Going back to Proverbs, it says, when I was a son with my father, tender, the only one in the sight of my mother. When you say the word Abraham, what are the next words that come out of your mouth? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. So wait a minute. Didn't Abraham have a bunch of sons? Why doesn't it mention Ishmael? He wasn't faithful. Why doesn't it mention all of the sons that he had with Keturah after Sarah had died? He had a number of sons. What about them? They weren't faithful. Oh, well, what about Isaac? Didn't Jacob have a brother? Yeah, his name was Esau. And he was a very carnal man, not interested in spiritual things. And when Jacob stole his birthright, he pleaded with his father with tears. But had he not sold that for a bowl of soup? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And don't you want your children to be like that? You want them, because the most valuable thing that we have in this world, and one of the most difficult things in this world, is your spiritual heritage. But Abraham, he had unfaithful children. Isaac had unfaithful children. Jacob had unfaithful children. But guess what they did? They kept on. How can we be an influence for good if we give up? And sometimes we have this idea of you can't beat them, join them. Join them. Where are they going? They're going in the wrong direction. Our only hope is that we can somehow inspire them because of the seed that we have planted, the seed that is so very powerful. The most important thing that we can teach our children is spiritual heritage. That is the most important thing. And are we doing that? He continues on in verse 4. He taught me and said to me, let your heart hold fast my words. Keep my commandments and live. Isn't that a strange statement? Keep my commandments and live? Well, wait a minute. We're living whether we keep the commandments or not. No, not really. You really don't know what life is about unless you're obeying God. Because that's the very essence. That's what gives meaning to life. And if we neglect the spiritual side, we're just kind of a placeholder. We're just going through life, just stumbling around in darkness. And then in verse 8, he says, prize her, and he's talking about wisdom, highly, and she will exalt you. She will honor you if you embrace her. Well, isn't honor important? We don't talk about honor very much in our society today. But you read old books, and one of the things that was prized most highly was honor. You did things that honored your family, that honored your country, that honored. Where is that? Well, we have to understand that if we prize wisdom, if we value wisdom, that wisdom will give us honor, give us prestige, give us an exalted place in life. And then in verse 9, she will place on your head a graceful garland. She will bestow on you a beautiful crown. You know, they say beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And there's a lot of truth to that. And I guess I'll have to confess my cultural ignorance. But when I look at a lot of what the world values as art, I can't see it. I mean, I look at Picasso and I just say, what is that? It looks to me like Emmett got a hold of some paint and threw it up against the paper. Now, that's just me, okay? But that painting may be worth $1 million, but I don't see it. Now, there are people that say that is beautiful, and they're entitled to their opinion. But when we talk about wisdom, that is true beauty. And you think about how ugly sin is and how destructive it is. What does it do? I know people that started down the wrong road, and they're fighting it with every fiber of their being. And most of the times they lose. They lose. They want to do right, but they're bound by their habits, by their sin. Wisdom frees us of that. Why start down that road that is going to destroy you? Verse 11, I have taught you the way of wisdom. I have led you in the path of uprightness. Now, there are a lot of people that can claim ignorance. I just do not know what God wants me to do. There are a lot of people now that's no excuse, but there are a lot of people that can claim ignorance. But can we claim ignorance? Can we say, I really don't know what God wants me to do with my life? Can we say that? No, we've been taught wisdom, most of us here, since we're knee high. We understand the precepts of God. And what's he saying here? We've been taught, we have been led, so why not follow through those things? He says, when you walk, your step will not be hampered. And if you run, you will not stumble. You know, one of the pictures that is used over and over again in the Old Testament is a deer running gracefully, covering just yards and yards and yards, and jumping high fences and going up to the top of mountains. And you think, this is the way a Christian is, because they have been free from all the things that bind them to this world. And if you run, is he not talking about freedom here? Not encumbered with all these weights that this world is placing at our feet. Verse 13, keep hold of instruction. Do not let her go. Guard her, for she is your life. Does that not paint the picture of someone trying to take this away from you? When you hear people talk about Christianity today, do they talk about it with honor? Do they talk about it as good things? Or do they talk about us as Bible thumpers? Well, if someone wants to call me a Bible thumper, I will say, yeah, I believe in it. I believe it's important to read it, to study it, to memorize it, to meditate on it. I'm not ashamed of it, because it is the way of life. But here's the word. He says, you've got to guard it. You've got to hold on, because there are people that are going to try to take it away. And sometimes those people will be in our own families that will mock it and belittle it and ridicule it. And you think, how sad. What are you giving me in its place? You know what? The answer is nothing. I don't get anything in return. They want me to give up this treasure, but they don't want to give me anything in return. We're just an animal. That we're here by accident. And where does this accident lead? To annihilation. Can you imagine The incredible shock. Well, I can't imagine how you would face death. I can read about atheists that have been very, very, very confident in ridiculing and mocking God when they were in good health and they were young. But when they're getting to the end of their life and they see the end in sight, they start wondering, well, what if I have it wrong? If I have it wrong and I pass from this life and I don't wake up, that'd be a loss. And if you could talk to me, I would say I would be disappointed. But what if I really, no. But I know the truth. Jesus says you shall know the truth and the truth shall set you free. And no man could have written the Bible. No authors, 40 authors could put everything together. No man could come and live the life that Jesus did. No man could die the death that he died, the way that he died. No, it is the truth. And if people want to ridicule, it makes me angry. It also makes me sorrowful because I think the God of this world has blinded their minds lest they should see the glorious gospel of Jesus Christ. It says, do not enter. Now pay attention to this. Everybody's trying to get us to do the bad things, the wrong thing. He says, do not enter the path of the wicked. What's he saying? Don't start down that road. Do not walk in the way of evil. Avoid it. Do not go on it. Turn away from it and pass on. How many times in these two verses does it say, don't start? Why? We all know people that have started down that road and they can't get off. Or they won't get off. For they cannot sleep unless they have done wrong. They are robbed of sleep unless they have made someone stumble. For they eat the bread of wickedness and drink the wine of violence. I'm reminded of Absalom. Absalom was an amazing person. He was one of these people that everybody liked. He could do anything. And his father just happened to be the king. And he very envious of his father. He wanted to destroy his father. So he sat at the gate, and when anybody came to seek counsel from the king, he would give them advice. And he'd tell them what they wanted to hear, and he did this for a couple of years until he won over the hearts of Israel. Isn't that what the text says? And then he came after David with an army, and he was going to kill his father. He was going to kill him. And why did he want to kill him? Because he wanted to be king. And he was getting advice from people like himself. And so David had to flee the capital, and if it had not been for one of his advisors that gave bad advice to Absalom, that Absalom believed, he would have succeeded. But God didn't want Absalom on the throne. He wanted Solomon, but that was years and years later. And what happened? His general killed Absalom. And David says, don't do him any harm. But Joab knew that as long as Absalom lived, that his life was in danger. And so I think he did it to save himself, save David from Absalom. But what happened? He starts down this road, and it just gets worse and worse and worse. And finally, it results in his death. Verse 18, but the path of the righteous is like the light of dawn, which shines brighter and brighter until full day. What is he saying? The way gets clear. It doesn't get more murky. It doesn't get darker. Now, there is a darker path, but this is what we choose. And if we choose it when we're young, it's going to make life a whole lot more pleasant. Or we can go down the way of the wicked, but it is like deep darkness. They do not know over what they stumble. So all of these people talk about the freedom that we have if we could just do away with religion. Well, that's been tried. Go back and study Stalin in the Soviet Union. That's what he did. He did away with most of religion. And of course, he mocked it and belittled it and ridiculed it. And it made him a better man, right? No. He was one of the most cruel men in history. He butchered millions of his own people. He starved millions of his best farmers to death. Why? Because they weren't on his side. He did not value your life. He valued his life. And so what did it do to the Soviet Union? What did it do to the common person? It made them despair. When you look at Russia today, do you see a happy people? There was an article, I've mentioned it before, it's talking about the premature death of millions and millions of people in Russia. And one of the main reasons given is because they have no hope. And we're talking about far more than economics. We're talking about far more than what kind of government you have. These people don't have the Lord. And so they do not have hope for the future. But no matter what happens in this life, we have Christ, right? We have hope. We have light. Verse 20, my son, be attentive to my words, incline your ear to my sayings. Hang on my every word, because my words are the way of life. Verse 23, keep your heart with all vigilance, for from it flow the springs of life. What is he saying? What we do comes from the heart. And he's not talking about the blood pump. He's talking about the inward nature of man, the resolve to go on and do the Lord's will. And he says, out of it determines what kind of life that we have. Then in verse 24, put away from your crooked speech and put devious talk far from you. Let your eyes look directly forward and your gaze be straight before you. Isn't this what he told Joshua, not to go to the left, not to go to the right? And what did Joshua do? He didn't go to the left, he didn't go to the right. He did the will of God. And then in verse 26 and 27, ponder the path of your feet, then all of your ways will be sure. Do not swerve to the right or the left. Turn your foot away from evil. When he says ponder, he's talking about to weigh, to examine. I don't want you to take these words as my words. These are inspired words from God. This is wisdom speaking through Solomon. And you think, what about Rehoboam, his son? How well did he mind these things? The answer is he didn't. When Solomon died and left the kingdom to Rehoboam, the people came and said, please lighten our taxes. We know your dad built the temple and palaces and fortresses and all of these things, and that was good. But now we want some relief. And so he went to his father's counselors, and they said, if you will lighten their load, they'll follow you. They'll be faithful to you. And so Rehoboam, that's not what he wanted to hear. So he went to his young friends, and they said, what do you think? You tell them that your father's not half the man that you are, that you're going to make them, their burdens heavier. Well, that's what he wanted. He wanted to be the man. And so He told the people. And what did they do? 10 tribes rebelled. And they went to war. Of course, God stopped it because he didn't want them fighting each other. That was not his purpose at the time. But what happened? Where did his choices lead him? Down a dark, dark, dark road. What good can you say about Rehoboam? He rejected everything that his father taught him. It wasn't that Solomon was not a good teacher. It's just that his student didn't want to learn. What do we say? You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. But I'll tell you what, we have a lot of young people in this congregation, and they are a lot more attentive the younger they are. And they'll listen to Bible stories, one after the other. They love to sing songs, one after the other. And we need to make sure that they get these lessons. And so that they have a foundation they can build on for the rest of their lives. Not only the rest of their lives, but the rest of eternity. And that's a challenge. And I think it's going to be even a greater challenge in the future than it has been in the past. Because more and more of the institutions that were encouraging the families are now discouraging families. So it's up to us, children of God, to value wisdom. So go back and read Proverbs, the 4th chapter. Go back and read this and mark these verses as an encouragement to inspire us to even greater heights in the future. But tonight, if you're not a child of God, we go to the Word of God to find out how we become a child. And Jesus said, he that believes and is baptized shall be saved. And so that should be enough for us. He tells us how to rid ourselves of sin. And then, if we're already children of God and we need to confess our faults before our brethren and pray for forgiveness, come us together. We stand and sing.